Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Shelley Oreo. In the next few episodes, we will examine how a rape murder cold case unfolded over the span of 30 years. I'm joined by District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert, Linda Thompson, retired Sheriff's Detective Ray Biondi, and DA Investigator Ron Garbrick. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Howdy.
Thank you.
Most people, Anne Marie, know who you are. You are a district attorney here. Linda, Ray, and Ron, can you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
I'll start with me. My name is Linda Thompson. Wilcoxson was my maiden name. And I live in the Sacramento area. I grew up here, went to school here, and I am the sister of Sharon Wilcoxson, who we are going to talk about today. I have a sister and a brother still living, and my sister lives in Rancho Cordova, and my brother lives in Portland area.
Great, Ray.
Hi, my name is Ray Biondi, and I retired from Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, where I put in 32 years. I retired in 1993, and at the time I retired, I was in charge of the Homicide Bureau, and I had been for 17 years.
Wow.
Howdy. My name is Ron Garbrick. I'm with the District Attorney's Office. I'm an investigator here. I've been here since 2005, and I work mainly cold cases, but basically every other murder that they need some assistance on. I did 21 years at the Sheriff's Department and worked in the Sheriff's Homicide from 95 to 05. So I'm still working.
Most people know I'm Anne Marie Schubert. I'm the District Attorney of Sacramento. I've spent my whole life as a prosecutor, graduated from law school in 89 and became a prosecutor right after that. But I've been in Sacramento since the mid-90s, and my passion in life has always been and always will be forensic DNA and cold cases. And I just want to make one comment about Ray Biondi that he underestimates is that he is a legend in the Sheriff's Department and the area of homicide, and anybody that has any understanding of the horrific crimes that happened in this community in the 70s and the 80s knows Ray Biondi.
Let's talk about this case. Linda, you had mentioned Sharon Wilcoxson was your sister.
Yes.
And she was 20 years old, is that correct? And
Yes.
living in Carmichael during the late 1970s. Sharon was tragically raped and murdered in her home sometime the night of New Year's Eve, 1978. We all know 40 years ago was a very different time. Can you also help set the scene? What was it like?
Well, we were kids, kind of going into adulthood, and we just sort of ran around with our friends, our girlfriends and our high school friends, and Sacramento was really safe. We would go to football games or parties. Our family, we were very, very close-knit, and a big part of that was because, unfortunately, in 1972, I came home from school one day and I found my father had passed away. My brother and I both, actually, and my brother was only about 9 years old at that time. I was 15, and that was a big traumatic event for us. It was extremely difficult, and we went through a lot at that time, but we grew closer and we took care of each other. My mom, they both owned a small sewing machine store in Carmichael, and my mom continued to work. And so I was the oldest, and we just learned to survive, and we learned to take care of each other. So when this crime happened to us, at the time I was living in South Lake Tahoe, working at Sahara Tahoe. And I got a call from a family member that they needed to come and get me. And my stepdad told me that my sister had been killed. And it took a really long time for me to process that. I thought he said she had been burned. And it just, I know just the shock of these two things in our lives was, it's just hard to believe because it doesn't happen in Sacramento at that time either, you know.
What was Sharon like growing up and as a young woman?
We were 18 months apart, so we were very, very close. She was very petite. She was just about 5 feet nothing. Very pretty. She had lots of friends. Everybody liked her in school. Everybody liked her in high school. She just had that way about her. But another thing to remember about her too is she was very compassionate and would give, anything to anybody. She worked extremely hard. I think she was still in high school. She started working at Bonanza Steakhouse, and she ended up becoming sort of a manager of that steakhouse. They took her on a trip around the world with a bunch of employees from that chain. So she had the opportunity to go on a trip around the world at 19 years old. She just was extremely loyal and loving and just kind.
So you had mentioned a little bit about when you found out. What was the initial impact on you and your family over the days and weeks that followed?
You just try to process what's happened. You try to figure out, where was she? Why was she home? Who was there? She had a very steady boyfriend at that time, who we really thought she would marry. His name was John Maloney. And a lot of my family put their suspicion on him because he was the one that found her. And I never thought for a minute that it was him because I knew he loved her too much to be able to do that. And so we just sort of tried to figure out how and why. And I remember preparing for the funeral, and I remember the detectives coming to the home and telling us that they were going to be at the funeral, but they were going to be hidden so they could see who came. And I remember going to her house to get clothes for her to wear to the funeral. And, that image never leaves. I still have memories of being there, and I didn't want to really touch anything, but just walking through and sort of seeing, fingerprint dust everywhere. And then the blood was just horrible. And then just trying to strengthen my mom, just really trying to help my mom. As a parent now, I can't imagine how she dealt with that all these years.
Thank you, Linda. Ray, I'm going to bring you in at this point. So you were the detective with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department at that time.
That's true.
Can you take us back to that night and walk us through the crime scene?
Back then, at the time, we were a relatively small unit, and it was my way of helping command these kind of cases. So I used to respond to just about every murder that ever occurred. And I remember getting at this house in the early morning hours. It was still dark. As we walked through the front part of the house, another detective pointed out that the speaker wire was missing. And so we were kind of saying, we're probably going to be looking at some kind of binding or bondage kind of situation. When I went back and I saw what happened to Sharon, it was rather like a rage kind of murder, I thought. There was a lot of overkill to me. And she must have had a real struggle because at one point she probably was on the bed. There was a lot of blood evidence there, but she was now laying on the floor next to the bed. The thing that really struck me that particular night, the first thing I got to thinking about was this was New Year's Eve. That's the one night in every year when there's a lot of people out that normally wouldn't be out. Even though it was cold, people still go on and celebrate New Year's Eve. Looking over the house, there was no forced entry, and that was kind of perplexing. We were trying to think, did she know somebody, or was it just the fact that there were so many people out that night celebrating, even in that neighborhood? Was she just kind of a target of opportunity? And we didn't get very far in either one, but So those were the challenges that we faced that particular night, trying to determine, of course, once we started getting her timeline, that she was home alone, and did a little canvas in that particular area. I mean, nothing stood out in terms of talking to neighbors next door in the other half of the duplex. But we did have something that really kind of made us very suspicious, and that was the next door. And that next door had an opening basically where you could walk from there right to their patio door where Sharon lived. And the gentleman there was Willie Thomas. And I wasn't the only one. The other detectives, because it was pretty cold by the time the sun come up, and here's this guy standing outside. He's watching every move we make. Very concerned about what we're doing. Tried to volunteer to help us out with the investigation. At one point, come search my house, whatever. And so he immediately became very interested in this person. We didn't learn a lot about him until like a day or so later. That same night, he had a dispute with his ex-wife, wanted her to come to his residence, and she lived with her parents in Pendon, California, which is ways away. She rebuffed him, and we're thinking maybe this could be kind of a target, a trigger to him take his rage out on someone else. So he became kind of the number one suspect right then. And then it was a subsequent interview another day after that, I think on January 2nd, which he was very adamant he was innocent and did not commit this murder. And from there, the investigation just went on and on. At one point, we realized that Sharon's car had been moved. And that was because of the way the seat was. She was a small individual, as Linda was saying, and had to be at least a 6-footer to reach the pedals in that car. In the daylight of that day, parts of contents of her purse were found in the area in a particular direction. There was a purse that was missing, which we never found. We determined there was a large knife was missing in the residence, which was never recovered. So from that point on, our investigation actually focused on Mr. Thomas.
He was the only suspect at that point?
He was the only real viable suspect. There were others, and it was a fairly high-profile case, and so we did get a lot of media leads, and those were all looked at, but we simply couldn't clear this individual as not being responsible.
What were some of the challenges then of making an arrest?
Well, evidence. Evidence. He was very good in his interrogations. He talked a lot about everything, but he never made no tacit admissions that we really can hang our head on. And there simply wasn't any real evidence. At the time, our technology was pretty low.
There's no DNA?
No DNA. We were aware of DNA, but it was only in exceptional circumstances could DNA be used, and then we had to go to a private lab, and I think the fee was like $5,000, and we didn't do that in every case.
Linda, did you know about Willie Thomas at that time? Had you known anything about her neighbor?
I remember there was talk of someone who lived near her. I remember that there was a party at the duplex next door that night, so you kind of think maybe it was somebody from there. And I know that there was talk about a neighbor that they were looking at, but that, the frustration, like he said, there was no physical evidence. And so, in a 21-year-old's mind, well, you wonder if there's somebody else out there who committed the crime. It's not that I dismissed him, but you just don't think, you just think of all the other people that it possibly could be. And I remember about the car, that he had driven the car. I actually drew a picture of her purse for them after they found the contents. But yeah, I didn't really focus that much on him, and I'm not sure why. we're thinking of everybody else, I guess.
I understand then in 1981, so a few years later, there was another stabbing murder. Can you tell us about that?
In the jurisdiction of Sacramento City, there was the murder of Ivan Coates, a young man who lived in the South area. And the first suspect that surfaced in that murder was Mr. Thomas. And in connection with the city and comparing cases, there were a lot of similarities. Number one, that Thomas lived in the same area, much like in Sharon's case, lived nearby. The manner of death was the same, stabbings and slashings. Things were missing from his personal contents. I believe it was his wallet and other things were missing from the house, the same as in Sharon when the purse was gone. The victim's car was taken, later recovered by City Police Department. In the city case, they actually had witnesses who saw Mr. Thomas leave the house. And he was apparently had some kind of relationship or association with the victim. And he was arrested by the city and, as I understand, later convicted of that murder and sent to prison.
But there is still yet no connection with Sharon's case.
No. At one point before he went to prison, we re-interviewed him again. And at the same time, we didn't get anywhere. He denied it, claimed not to even commit the murder that he was convicted for.
I'm now going to move to about 20 years later in 2000 or 2001, when the case goes to the district attorney's cold case unit. Anne Marie, first, for listeners who don't know about the cold case unit, can you explain how and when that was created, and then when you received this particular case?
So, just a little bit about my background. My first DNA case that I ever had was in the mid-'90s, and that was when I was in another DA's office. And that's when, at least for myself, I realized the power of the technology. It was still kind of new and novel at that time, and it was nowhere near the advancement it is now, but it was a very powerful tool. So I came to Sacramento in 96, and I was doing child abuse and sex crimes, and many of the sex crimes, sexual assault stuff, had forensic evidence. So I was doing more of those cases. I had a big DNA case involving a serial child molester. Ray may remember a guy named David Funston who kidnapped a number of little kids in Sacramento, and that was proven through DNA. And so as I kind of went up through the office, I started actually teaching cold case for the Department of Justice. And I then, probably in 99 or 2000, I went to Jan Scully, who was the DA at the time, and said, I really think we should start a cold case unit. I also said, I think we should try to solve the East Area rapist, because we all knew the impact that had had. But I would like to believe that we were kind of the forefront of DA's offices of kind of taking a leadership role on these types of cases. The other benefit we have in our county is the DA's office has its own crime lab, which is a really significant thing, because if, Detective Biondi or Ron Garvick has a case that they want DNA testing done, is we can help prioritize those cases. So, with the blessing of Jan and the administration, we started the cold case unit, I want to say probably 2000, 2001. And really what we did, I could spend all day talking about this because it is interesting, but at least from my perspective, is we basically, we said, okay, we're going to start this, but how do we figure out the cases? And because you can't just, go through thousands of cases because it'll take so much time. So what we did was twofold. Is one, we went around to the retired guys as well as the active homicide detectives, Sheriff's Department, Police Department, and said, we're going to do this. Tell us the cases that have always stayed with you. Give us a list of unsolved that you think there's biological evidence in that we can do DNA testing. And one of the guys that worked for Ray was a guy named Stan Reed, who was a longtime homicide guy. And actually Stan had a list of the cases that always stayed with him. Mm-hmm. And Sharon's case was on that list. Other cases, Shannon Ritter, Stephanie Black, cases of those are the names of the victims. And so we kind of started with that. We also started with the police department. And I've told this story before. The number one case, one of theirs was a woman named Eva Chu, who was 7 months pregnant, who was kidnapped, raped, and murdered. That case got solved with DNA. And then the other way we started kind of compiling our list is that we went to, this is before computers, so we had a card catalog of all the, Ray probably remembers this, John O'Mara, who was the head of homicide, we had a card catalog, 3x5 cards of all the cases that were filed, and it was all typed, right, because we didn't have computers. So we literally went through those by hand. I'm sure Ron Garvick remembers, because one of the very first cases that was solved in the cold case unit was the murder of a young girl named Ollie George, who was killed by a guy named Dennis Nelson. And so when we were going through the card catalogs, we started looking through these, and one of the cases that popped out was a case that had been filed. We had charged somebody, but we didn't have enough evidence to proceed. It was a rape murder. This is another young lady in the city. And so those were kind of the ones, these are the cases we should pick because they're rape murders and maybe there's biological evidence. So, we compiled a list of city cases, county cases, and, I don't want to say I'm not trying to simplify it, but, you're looking for the cases that are murders that you expect to have biological evidence, whether it's blood evidence, whether it's semen. And so you start with those because that's what you're looking for. And so that's where we started. There's some that you have no idea who the suspects are. Like some of the cases we filed, we had no clue. Person's name was never in a file. But then you have a case like Sharon's where I would call it like a warm hit instead of a cold hit. We know what cold hits are when you just match somebody that you never knew it was going to be. But a warm hit is like they may have thought somebody might be suspicion or a person of interest, but you don't really know for sure. And so we kind of looked at that, and, that's kind of how the unit started. It was, folks like Ron Garvick was a DA investigator, other people in the office. We work with the sheriff's department. We still do that, our police department. And it's really just a collaborative effort of saying, here's the cases we think we have a shot at. And honestly, a huge number of cases were solved because we just re-looked at them and found the evidence, and then ultimately made arrests and prosecuted people.
Sharon's case was one of the first cases.
It was a rape murder. That was, we knew from the outset to get graphic here, but we knew from the outset that she'd been bound. She'd had her throat slit. And we knew that at the time of the autopsy that there was evidence collected from her body, biological materials in the rape kit. But just remember, this is 78, 79. This is long before DNA. You knew that there was semen or sperm, I should say, but we couldn't identify somebody at that time. So that's the kind of cases that, when we were looking through cold cases, you pull out the binder. One of the first things you do is you look at the autopsy and you look at whether or not there was sperm found so that you can then test that. And we've done it on many cases. This is where you find your evidence, and that's what leads you to the suspect.
Anne Marie, what then led to an arrest and filing of a case? Was there a DNA hit?
There was a DNA match. So as Ray Biondi mentioned, he was, at the time of the DNA match to Willie Thomas, he was already incarcerated doing life on this other murder.
The 1981
So ironically, he's, this murder happens New Year's Eve on 78 into 79, but then he gets arrested in 81. He's then arrested and convicted, and he goes to prison. So now he's in prison, which is good for us because we're not worried about public safety now, he's at least in terms of he's in custody. So then we do the DNA testing, and then that DNA is compared to his DNA profile. So everybody in California that's a convicted felon has to give their DNA. It is this extraordinary tool for law enforcement to both identify people and exclude people. So he was identified as the person who left behind the evidence. And so from that point, the good benefit is that he's in jail. He's in custody. So there's more ability to kind of prepare. That's where Detective, I'm not sure if she went by Gregerson or Timberlake, but Lori Gregerson, I think it was at the time, and Marcy Minter, I think, was the other homicide investigator. They became the detectives, in 2002, and then they did the follow-up that they needed, which included going to the prison to interview him. I remember it distinctly because I went with them. But just that was kind of that, and then we prepared ourselves. We knew that we had the evidence that Ray had always been looking for, that physical evidence that connected him to that murder, because we're never going to just charge somebody because we think they did it. Right. We have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And when somebody tells you that there's no reason for my DNA to be in somebody's body, and it is there, they're lying to you. That's the bottom line. And we knew from the bindings, we knew from the physical evidence that he was the person that had raped and killed Sharon.
Linda, did you know, and did your family know that the DA's office was now taking on the case?
We were contacted, I think in 2002. A detective came. We live in a duplex, and my mother was living on the opposite side of us prior to her death, so that we could watch after her and take care of her. And a detective came to the door, and I was at work and talked to my husband and my son, and started explaining that they were looking for my mother. They were looking for Ethel Ray. And did they know where she was? And my husband explained that that was his mother-in-law, and that I was at work that night. At that time, I was working 2 jobs. And the detective said that when she gave him the card and said, when she gets home, we really need you to call. I need her to call me. It's important. And it's about, I think he said it was about her sister, Sharon. So when I got home, 10 o'clock at night, I called this person, and he just explained to me that he was working with prosecutors, I believe, and the sheriffs, and that there was possibly going to be an arrest finally for the murder of Sharon. And I just can't even tell you, my mind was just completely... It was just more than I could ever imagine. I had, I had moved on in my life. It had been like 23 years, I think, and struggled as a young adult, drinking, drugs, different things like that. Just trying to find my place, and I got my act together, and I sort of just put that away so that we could survive. And so he told me what was happening, and that we were going to have a press conference, I think, or put me in contact with Anne Marie, or the detective. I can't remember, Lori, maybe. Or, yeah. And sort of the good and bad in all of this is that my mother had passed away just a few months before this happened. And he apologized to me and said, "I'm just so sorry that your mom is gone." And I told him that I was not. I was glad that she had left, because I knew that she was with Sharon and that she already knew everything that happened. And at the time when we went in to meet with Anne Marie and the others, my whole experience since this happened, we never knew that she was raped. We never knew any of that. I don't know if my mom did, and she never told us. I don't know for sure. I can't say, but we never knew that. So for us, that was sort of going through it all again after we found that out. And I remember her boyfriend, John, was in the meeting with us. And I remember turning to him and saying, "Did you know about this?" And he didn't know either. Because I kept saying DNA, how did they have DNA? And somebody said, well, maybe it's blood, and so that was a shock to us.
Just to clarify the timeline at this point, the DNA hit was in the spring of 2002, and then in August 2002, Thomas was charged. Join us for our next episode, where we pick up from after charges were filed to the building of the case through the court process and reflections from the DA, the investigators, and Linda Thompson.
Thank you for listening.
and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.